Greetings and salutations. This is Jason Silverain, and before we begin, I want you to think back to an earlier time. It's 1989, the Nintendo Game Boy has just been released in Japan and North America. The following year it would take Europe by storm, and it's the birth of an iconic handheld system that would continue to be in production until 2003, even when its superior successors have already entered the market. The Game Boy Color of 1998, the Game Boy Advance of 2001. 1,056 games, not including the cancelled and unlicensed games, were released for it, and one more is about to be added to that total. Consider if Dragonborne had been released during this time. The quality of its music and the excellent sprite work alone would have brought it notice. The multiple endings, extremely unusual in handheld games for the time, and the lack of game overs allowing even a younger audience to play the game. All of these would have attracted a lot of attention. Pre-1993 it had been remembered as an early classic created by SpaceBot Interactive, the three-man group of basically bedroom programmers. It's a great attempt to reach the quality of the core Nintendo franchises of that era, even if they didn't quite measure up. Though, if it had been released a little later, after Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, it would have had a much harsher criticisms and comparisons. However, today in 2020, the story's a little different. Game design has evolved a lot since then, and there are many elements common in that era that we can simply avoid for a better gameplay experience, whilst keeping that retro feel, and this is where I think the game lets itself down a little bit. Normally I tend to make my written reviews a lot more in-depth and generalise in my videos, but I really feel that SpaceBot Interactive have so much potential in their future titles. I want to cover why I grew so frustrated with the game in my playthrough, and the various design elements that undermine my enjoyment of the game, while also highlighting the positive, and kind of have something a little bit more in-depth with some proper constructive criticism. However, I will state before I begin that Dragonborne is no means a bad game. Many of the issues are partly caused by the limitations of GB Studio, and at its core it's an enjoyable RPG that obviously had a lot of care and passion in its making. Beginning on a positive note, the story is simple but charming. Playing as Kris, the young son of the kingdom's dragon slayer, in that classic sense you're woken up by your mother explaining that your father has gone missing, and asks you to search for him. Throughout the game you find various torn pages of your father's diary, and as you talk to various NPCs, it expands the lore of the game itself, focusing mostly on Kris's history and how he became dragon-blooded, and thus able to learn magic, and a little bit of the kingdom's circumstance, and the history of the dragons. Whilst there's quite a lot of reiteration in this information, as a whole it's a well-told tale. However, the game doesn't hold your hand, and at times it doesn't provide any information on how to proceed, requiring the player to talk to every NPC or search every spot again until something happens. And in some cases it speaks to one NPC, which then makes another NPC elsewhere suddenly help you progress. And not always is that clear. In many cases, NPCs will mention a location, a character or item with no indication of where they are, how they can be obtained, or even a general direction like, oh, you could get iron ore from the mines. But then no direction of where the mines are. They're thankfully up north because the game is so contained in each section. But as you free up more and more areas to explore, this can get rather tiresome. And there's also the issue with the fact there's no way to fast skip through text boxes, especially with long conversations, so you end up button mashing through the whole conversation and risk accidentally starting all over again like a very particular owl. I believe the earliest example that really stood out to me was after the first dungeon. There was absolutely no indication of where to go next, and I spoke to every villager in the town, and it wasn't until I accidentally stumbled into the local cult group and this boulder blocking my path that I had a indication of what I needed to do next. It took me searching every house again until randomly one of the NPCs owned dynamite. It would have made a lot more sense if this chap had lived near the mines in the north, or there was any indication he was an alchemist or a miner beforehand. But no, I even thought the house he was in before was locked. So that got a little frustrating, and this kind of thing happens periodically. Thankfully, this is more prevalent in the early game than anything, and as the story progresses, it all gets a lot more streamlined and a lot clearer with the directions what you need to do. Moving on, the art design is simply fantastic. The sprite work is eye-catching, with several areas having unexpected visual details, such as the shadows from the mast on the boat trip, which really impressed me. But the most noticeable is the full-screen character sprites during combat. With the player's character sprite changing as he gains new armor and enemies leaving an impact, you could really recognise foes, not just from their overworld sprites, but in combat as well. But of all of them, it's the character design that really steals the show, with some of the best I've seen on a handheld of its era. The room-filling size of the character really gives that powerful boss impression, and the animations for most of the dragon moves are quite impressive, especially for a Game Boy. The music is equally as impressive, especially for an homebrew game, and they are all original compositions by SpaceBot Interactive. Though several of the tracks do consist of quite short loops, which causes them to grate slightly on the nerves after some time. There also seems to be the occasional place where there's a few uncomfortably high pitches and volume variations between the tracks. However, I do believe this was caused by the emulation software I was using and the fact I was wearing headphones, making this kind of thing far more noticeable. Coming out of an actual Game Boy, I'm sure this would be completely fine. As a whole though, it's just simply great work. Another point I'd like to highlight as a good example of positive game design are the towns and townsfolk. Many RPGs in general rarely fail to make a town feel alive or populated in any way. You have maybe 4 people in a town, and that's not even a hamlet. Now in Dragonborne, the villagers never really felt out of place in their design, except for some elements of the last town, which was just a bit too sparse and a bit too spread out. But the fact that the villagers were actually concerned with their day-to-day lives rather than anything else was a really nice touch, and yeah, as a whole, the villagers were pretty damn charming, even if in some places they were just a bit empty. As a whole, the overworld was visually interesting, designed in such a manner that was plenty to explore without the player feeling lost, which is fantastic for a game with no mapping system. However, this enjoyment was eroded by the sheer amount of long backtracking and lack of interaction with the world in general. The lack of movement variety, shortcuts or options made long trips required for the multiple fetch quests in the early game feel tedious at points, and one-way travel such as leaping down spots or shortcuts through areas in the early game, or items that allowed quick travel or faster movement speed would have gone a long way to improve this. This was especially prevalent in the dungeon design, which suffered from having big empty rooms, long corridors, and areas designed to act as time or RNG gates. I think if the larger areas had been broken down into smaller rooms with multiple pathways and more to explore, it would have had the effect of making the dungeon feel larger whilst also improving them visually. And various dungeons, especially the last one, did use this technique in places, which made me wonder why it wasn't used more. However, the variety in dungeons is to be commended, each with a unique visual appeal, and you actually made an ice and water dungeon that wasn't torturous to go through. For those who haven't studied video game design, I just want to explain what I mean by gating and time gating in this instance. Traditionally, gating is a level design technique that consists in confining the player to a small area or blocking access to the next area until the player completes a given objective or specific action. There's several kinds of gating, such as simple gating, which would be finding a key to a door or solving a puzzle in a room. Regional gating, which requires a skill or item to progress, such as the diving suit in Dragonborne, and encounter gating, which is usually forced combats, arena-based in most cases, or boss battles before play can progress. Time gating is traditionally associated with MMOs. For example, if you needed 3 essence to progress, but you only could get 1 essence a week, that would force you to wait 3 weeks before you could continue the game, and that would be a form of time gating. RNG elements can also be considered a form of time gating, as they are not put under their own category. The example in Dragonborne's case would be one of the later puzzles. It's 8 buttons in a room. There is no indication what is the correct button. But if you press the wrong button, you are teleported to the beginning of the dungeon, and thus have to redo your progress. Also, if you press the wrong button, you may have combat dropped on you, which would be a mixture of time gating and encounter gating. And various elements throughout the game repeat this. Many of the early puzzles in Dragonborne are block pushing puzzles. This is very traditional. You have a marked square on the ground, you push said block to square. However, as the game progresses, the puzzles get more obtruse, and eventually it becomes just either pure random, or just with no indication of what is needed to be done. You end up brute forcing your way through them. Many of them are not very hard, but they don't really feel like puzzles, and it seems more like random guessing as you just push a block in any direction and wait to see what occurs. The button pushing puzzles are especially egregious to this. As previously mentioned, many of them have absolutely no indication of what the button does, what could be the correct answer, and I really think the game would have benefited from things like riddles and clues that actually tied in with these button pushers. For example, having a group of statues of different things and having a riddle, and you have to press them in the right order, as opposed to, say, pushing a button in one room, going to another room, pushing the button in that room, and back and forth without any clear indication of what is occurring. Because, to be fair, the game doesn't really indicate to the player very well when they've done something that actually matters. There is no audible cues, there's very few written cues that pop up in text boxes. Only major buttons seem to do this. And it's not always clear when a puzzle is confined to a single room or several rooms. As a result, most of the puzzles come down to pure trial and error and player persistence, rather than any logical thinking and working through, which is a real shame, but I think it mostly comes down to GB Studios' limitations and developers' own inexperience in game design. This is this first game, and I do think that from here on we can only see improvements and things getting better from this already relatively good starting point. But there is one puzzle I do want to just highlight, and it's the one that caught me off guard the most, and it's the same kind of puzzle that I once encountered in another game that once stopped me from continuing that game for over a year. And that is the princess puzzle, where the princess is supposed to turn up at the blacksmith's place at a certain time. And all you have to do is wait. And there is no indication of this. And I only completed that puzzle because I received a text message at the same time and was replying to it, and the 1 or 2 minute waiting time just passed by. The last time I encountered one of these puzzles was in Breath of Fire 3, when I was supposed to pray before a statue, and there was no indication of how I was supposed to do this, other than stand still for a minute. Well played. However, you're going to catch a lot of players off guard with that particular puzzle. This area and movement designs also tie into the collectibles and various items within the game. Several of the collectibles are invisible with no indication they are present until you walk over them. This turns them into a pixel hunt, which in every tile needs to be examined just in case. Combined with the slow clunky movement and the huge windy areas, this quickly becomes a chore and kills any motivation to try unless you're really determined to get that top rank. In addition, there was no total of these items given, so I had no idea of how many I was missing. I mean, in my playthrough I got 9 golden dragons. It was only later I discovered I needed 16. I thought I'd gotten most of them. Personally, I feel that nothing would have been lost by placing more of these golden dragons in chests, and in fact it would actually have made the search for treasure a lot more rewarding. Throughout the game you end up finding quite a lot of chests, but nearly all of them contain just healing items, which can be bought from the store, and thus, over time, when you realise there's no actual items beyond this in the game, it kills any excitement in finding a chest, and usually the trouble of earning the chest. is not worth the reward. So from a game design point of view, it really helps the player's enjoyment by rewarding this exploration. More chests containing coins would have been welcome as well. Throughout the game, there's various sources of money. The initial source is the monsters you fight, but it's such a low amount that it barely covers the cost of the potions that you use to defeat them. And the major source turns out to be fishing. Unfortunately, as charming as the little fishing game is, it just comes down to mashing A, and you have to do this periodically, and it takes about 5 minutes to catch the maximum amount of fish each time. Other mini-games throughout the game are also very RNG related. I mean, visually they look very nice, but it just comes down to hitting A and hoping you win, because you have no player agency. I do admire the fact that you've gone out of your way to try and put some of the more uncommon mini-games in the game, but I really wish there was just more we could do to interact with them. And finally, the core mechanic of the game. The combat. And I might sound a little outgoing here, different from most other reviewers who have covered this game and have really enjoyed it and enjoyed the combat system. Personally, I despised it by the end of the game. There was a lot of little elements that built up and killed my enjoyment of it. And again, this is all personal preference from design points of view, but some of it is the limitations of GB Studio, and since I've learned that, I've been a lot more forgiving in my experience. During my initial playthrough, when I did not know these certain issues were caused by it, I got frustrated to no end. Now, the combat is very basic. You have attacks, magic, special attacks, and the capability to use items. You cannot flee, and, strangely enough, no missing occurs. This caught me off guard and resulted in many early deaths for me when I thought that the enemies did have a chance to miss me. The early game is also where the game is at its most dangerous, as you're limited to only regular attacks and using items. You've got to just hope that you succeed in the damage race that occurs. With no option to flee, you have to use your potions sparsely because of the lack of money as well. Doing this is more difficult than it sounds, however, as all you have is a health bar which isn't very accurate to judge how much damage you have. Now, the dev did explain much later, after I'd finished the game, that due to frame issues with GB Studios, that was the reason he couldn't add numbers or replace the health bar with numbers, and I perfectly understand that, but this really did mess with me throughout the whole game and caused a constant source of frustration. Even as more abilities were unlocked as I progressed, I felt like the magic and sword abilities really didn't have enough impact. In many cases, they even did less damage than a regular attack, and this was pretty frustrating, as these are limited resources that you have to restock and refresh every so often. The only exceptions to this were the final magic I learned and the sword I found in the final dungeon. These actually started hitting hard, and it felt like this is what these special abilities should have been doing all along. This also applies to the armor upgrades as well. While visually interesting, it really felt like that's all they were. Throughout the game, the enemies constantly keep level with you, and every combat feels the same, mostly because it all boils down to hammering the enemy as fast as you can, drinking health potions like energy drinks, and just hoping they will not use some of their more powerful abilities, which they can just spam over and over and over. During my playthrough, I recognised how the developer actually programmed this behaviour in, and after speaking with them, it turns out I was pretty accurate. It's a table with a list of the enemy's moves in, each with a percentage chance of activating, and then a dice roller is rolled to determine which of the ones is chosen. I do think some of those percentages really need to be altered, or potentially something to affect the dice roller to say, okay, this move has been activated. then don't do it again next round, or alternatively certain moves requiring more than a single turn's build-up. I'm not sure how you do this in GB Studio, but if you're going to have enemies that do stun locking moves or completely prevent the player responding, then it's something you have to look into, because this is just not very fun when all agency is taken away from you. Looking at the combat from a theory of game design angle as well, I don't really think it caters to player needs. How to explain this without the source material is a little difficult, but I'll try. Essentially, there's different types of players, and each type of player has a particular need. For example, you have the power gamers who enjoy feeling progression, character growth, leveling, things like that, which is not present in this game. You have the looters, who enjoy gaining treasure and all that. That's not present in the combat either, because you barely get any coins or reward for beating monsters. And then you get the tacticians, who enjoy the tactical elements of the combat, which again, due to the RNG nature and the limited player feedback with the health bars and things like that, I think that's the closest one it caters to, but it's still a little weak. One little exploit I did find though, for anyone who does play this game, and I do recommend actually getting it, as much as I'm hammering it, this is just in-depth feedback, which I promise the devs I do in this review. Use strength potions on the dragons. I experimented on the final boss, and those things stack, and that is actually the most effective method of damage in the whole game. If anything, I did more damage using 3 strength potions in a row and then hitting with a normal attack than any of my special moves. And that, my friends, is how you get past some of the cheaper bosses in this game. So, winding down, how do we wrap all this up? Well, first of all, Dragonborne is an excellent GB Studio game. It is possibly one of the best homebrew games made in GB Studio. Do not get me wrong. However, that software does have limitations, and it has affected the quality of the game in places. There's certain design elements that can definitely be improved, dungeon design and puzzle design notwithstanding. The combat was mostly limited by GB Studio, and I think with some tweaks it would have been a lot more bearable. The physical copy of the game, the quality is fantastic from what I've seen. I made a mistake in my playthrough from what I heard with someone, as they thought it came with no manual. Having looked at one or two other reviews since, it comes with a wonderful looking manual, the cart is gorgeous. I mean, it is a collector's piece. It is definitely a collector's piece. Also, I really believe the speedrunning community and TaskBot could do fantastic things with this game if they can get into its head. If they can figure out a few kind of exploits here and there, or how to affect the percentage base in the random combat rolls, I definitely see this being a fun one to actually see people race each other in. So, I recommend it. I will warn people of frustration, and if you get stuck with the puzzles, well, the devs have been very gracious and put most of the playthrough up on their own YouTube channel. And thank you for listening. I know this was a little bit in-depth and maybe a bit more aimed at the devs than the public. Partly apologetic for how much I ranted and got angry during that playthrough, and I feel bad that I resorted to save states in that playthrough. I really didn't want to. But you've not made a terrible game here. You've made something pretty damn solid, and as much as you have someone who's a bit of a miserable git like me rant and rave, you know, keep at it. I am looking forward to see what you do in the future, and I think that you guys should possibly try and see if you can get this on the Nintendo Store, because having this as just a single cart release is a bit of a waste. I think this needs to be spread a bit further.